Before we dig into blockchain, one thing that I find super impressive is all these ad folks here at a conference the week before Black Friday. So I don't know about you, but this is a pretty stressful time for me. So I'm going to make a promise to you in this presentation. I'm not going to stress you out. So I'm not going to tell you that, hey, when you come back in January, you're going to have to be experts in blockchain. Otherwise, some robot's going to take your job. I'm not going to tell you that. Kind of the cool thing about blockchain is that it actually is going to permeate almost everything that you do, but it could be completely innocuous to how you do your job. So first and foremost, right now, there's a lot of hope in blockchain. So it's going to reinvent the government, it could reinvent advertising. Oil consortiums are building blockchains to manage their supply chain. The financial services industry is using it to basically take out intermediaries from the process and create more efficiency. Or you could be like this guy who did an initial coin offering so that people could actually pay for his time and advice. So I think he's an investor and he's giving advice to startups, but basically he put a token out there, and if you want to sit down with him, you actually got to pay in tokens. So now the other thing about blockchain is that it feels kind of nerdy, kind of feels like one of those new Revenge of the Nerds going to take over advertising, something that has been heard time and time again. But one thing I do want to point out, because this is a common misconception, is blockchain is not Bitcoin, and it's not Ethereum, so it's not a virtual currency. What it is basically the underlying technology, which if you were going to trade a virtual currency, because think about like Bitcoin and Ethereum, there's nothing there, right? It's basically, it's completely virtual. There's no paper, it's not backed by gold. But what the people that trade in Bitcoin needed to know was that the transactions that they made could be verified, validated, and that they would hold up over time. So, and this is kind of where I almost got lost and kind of walked away from learning more about blockchain, is somebody was basically told me, hey, it's a ledger, you know? Yay, really exciting. Same concept as, you know, the horse traders in the Gilded Age. Basically, it is a record of transactions. Okay, this is about the point where everyone's probably going to get back on their cell phones, maybe start checking their email, but wait, this is going to get good. This is going to get exciting here. So let me first kind of walk you through why everyone's excited about the technology. So a transaction is recorded in this ledger, which that's called a block. And what happens is that block links to the previous and subsequent blocks in the chain. So going back to kind of the initial use case of this with Bitcoin, basically, if you're going to do a monetary transaction, you needed that to be locked, right? And so hence, visually, this is why it's called the blockchain. You can't actually change one block without changing the previous and the subsequent block. So that actually gives it a premise for being able to be kind of locked and unchangeable. So thereby you have security layer number one. Now what happens is when an update is made to that blockchain, the updates are going to be distributed to all the participants in the network, and then it's going to be encrypted by mathematical proof. So this is the one thing that you probably have heard a lot about with blockchain, is that it's decentralized. But what does that actually mean? Basically, Satoshi Nakamoto, basically, who may or may not be a real person, but is the person who actually, or the entity, the he, she, it, or they, that actually invented the concept of blockchain, they didn't want any kind of central ownership over this. They wanted to be basically a self-evolving, kind of self-policing ecosystem. And so the one way to do that was make sure that no central authority had sole control over the information, but also on top of that, back to, you know, those trading in a virtual currency want to actually have security for those transactions. Basically, everyone on the network will get updated so there's no single point to attack. So security layer number two. Here's a block. So blocks are real. They're real things. They're in essence, and you can kind of start in your own head translating this to advertising, right? Digital advertising, where this could have been an ad interaction where you had an advertiser, a publisher, and a consumer. Now, one thing to kind of keep in mind when you're looking through this is you see a lot of hashes or encryption. So that's the other thing about blockchain is that entities on the blockchain can remain anonymous, right? So an advertiser, a consumer, or a publisher could remain anonymous in a blockchain, but ultimately the transaction itself, everyone sees it, right? So an advertisement occurs, anyone who's on the blockchain would be able to see that. So the transparency is security layer number 3. Okay, at this point, it still kind of wasn't making sense to me, but I'll tell you one thing that was kind of the light bulb moment. In Shelley's presentation, he talked about it yesterday. It's the concept of smart contracts. So this is the other cool thing about blockchain, is that you can program on top of it. So if you imagine this potential ad blockchain, which is open source, anybody could program on top of that. And basically what a smart contract is a set of conditions which when occur, it basically triggers an action, right? So financial services, transaction occurs, the dollars basically change hands, potentially in virtual currency, and all of that happens in real time. That same premise can apply when it comes to advertising. Okay, so that's the basic premise of how blockchain works. Talk a little bit about what this actually means for the advertising industry. Okay, so before we dig in, I'm going to give you a legend because I'm actually going to walk through kind of a hypothetical scenario. This means you probably will see it, maybe not at huge scale, but you will see it in 2018. This means next couple years, it actually could accelerate faster because this is a crazy stat. Right now in GitHub, there's about 80,000 different blockchain projects that are actually being developed. And there is a ton of investment dollars going into the blockchain development community. So that could actually accelerate. The rainbows and unicorns does not mean it's fantasy land. What it means is that there's help needed. And so when I say kind of needs help, think about it more like a killer app or something that occurs to, say, get consumers bought off on the concept to be able to kind of dive in and actually be a part of a blockchain. Okay, so starting first with what this is, what is this going to mean for brands? You kind of heard a little bit about it yesterday with Mark Pritchard's interview, unlocking more working dollars. So I'm going to walk you through a potential blockchain here. This is hypothetical. But what I will say, just to kind of give this a little bit of tangibility, there is a company out there called MetaX, and they've actually built fundamental pieces of what the advertisers would need as part of this blockchain, the publishers, and also the consumers. So this is hypothetical all the way to the end, but there are pieces that are already out there in pilot right now. So first thing that needs to happen is a bid request needs to happen, right? So much like in programmatic today, a DSP that's on this hypothetical ad blockchain makes a bid request. But instead of it saying, hey, I'm willing to buy impressions at a certain rate, which a lot of what we know about fraud and viewability, that impressions aren't the most efficient way to buy advertising, but it's kind of all we got. Let's say that the bid request is around a verified consumer engagement. So a publisher who's on the blockchain is going to fulfill that request. Now, a verified engagement from a consumer. So the consumer is verified and the actual engagement itself is verified. The conditions as part of the smart contract are determined, and based on those conditions being met, that media supplier makes a micropayment. Okay, and I'm going to get into a little bit more about what I mean by micropayment. But when you're actually talking about the cool stuff, this is what comes next. So that same consumer that actually did that engagement, let's say that they go and they actually purchase the product. That consumer could actually receive a micropayment themselves. So they could actually be compensated for their time. Then, let's say that same customer goes on Instagram. They make a post talking about everything that they enjoyed about the product, basically becoming an influencer. They receive another micropayment. That post then leads to additional sales by those that actually saw the post, and that original consumer gets a micropayment for all of those. Then, after some time with the product that they bought, they go on Amazon, they do a positive review, they get another micropayment. So this is really kind of the premise that, I've been involved in blockchain for about a year now, and every time I try and shoot bullets at it, you start to see that the underlying technology is sound, but ultimately this is actually something worth chasing. This is a very interesting opportunity when you think about why consumers have trouble with advertising, what we're actually trying to do to engage our consumers, and more importantly, making all of our media dollars work. Other cool piece to this is the concept of a self-policing ecosystem. So this is something that MetaX is working on with their ad chain, where actually the publishers self-police other publishers on the blockchain. So basically, they're looking at publishers, and they're basically in a sense, vouching for other publishers by way of the tokens called an ad token. And if a publisher proves to be, providing low quality or fraud, then they can be removed from the blockchain, and those that actually vouch will actually see tokens deducted from their account. Now, this kind of sounds a little bit tricky, like, hey, publishers rating other publishers, judging, lots of judging. The one thing that's going to have to happen in order for this to work is the publishers have a huge incentive to get not only scale on that blockchain, but also quality. So that could be the trigger as to what could make that work. Now for agencies, unlocking true transparency. So every agency right now is heard the word transparency maybe 1 or 2 times this year, probably not more than that, just kidding. But as an agency that's 7 years old and has kind of put transparency as a pillar of what we believe in, the first thing I always say is, how do you know somebody's truly transparent? Because it's really hard work. So we're a 7-year-old agency. We've invested multiple millions of dollars in our data infrastructure just to give clients the transparency that they're asking for and what is possible. Now, for an agency to be able to have an easier way to go about providing transparency, because you think about that block that I talked about, right, where every kind of transaction, however you defined it, is actually open and available for everyone, then transparency, in a sense, is achieved. So this is going to be what's cool. The ability for agencies to data mine the blockchain. Same goes for advertisers, but what's really interesting for agencies is agencies, and I run an analytics team, the thing that's really hard is you're having to do analytics tasks across many clients, all of which have some similarities in their technology and data stack, but mostly a lot of differences. So trying to scale and actually be able to build things that can really provide a lot of high value as opposed to just low value getting information. With blockchain, the promise of that actually becoming a lot easier becomes pretty real, right? Because this is the cool thing, is that a blockchain, in essence, that everyone's using is a standardized data set. So nobody has to try and figure out how the data set works. They'll be able to program on top of it and then be able to build high-value activities around it to generate real insights. And this gets back to there's been a lot of talk at this conference about attribution. I've actually been in the attribution space since about 2007, and I can tell you it's hard. It is really hard. You have addressable media, non-addressable media. You have different technologies providing some information and not other information. If everybody has availability to what is essence, the Uber log file of what's occurring in advertising, this actually presents scale and opportunity. So here's the opportunity for everybody. And I'm going to put a name on it, call it the participation economy. It's this universe where advertisers, media suppliers, and consumers are all participating in the same economy, and they're all getting benefit out of it. So just to kind of give you an example of what that could look like, and actually the panel that was on before was talking about ad blocking, but there's a browser called Brave. Now, cool thing about it is the person who started Brave is also the same person who started Firefox and was also the inventor of JavaScript. So this is pretty real, and when you actually kind of dig in, and I've actually been a user for a few months now, it's actually a very robust piece of software, but this is what it does. It's actually ad blocking as a browser, right? So everyone in the room can be like, oh, great, another friggin' ad blocker we got to deal with. But what's really cool about this, and they tapped into something, is that when you're actually using it, it's actually quantifying the time you're saving by them actually blocking ads and trackers, right? So it's reinforcing the consumer proposition. At the end of the day, we're all consumers, so to a certain extent, we get it. But it's actually giving you kind of a running tally on the time that you're saving. Now, this is where it gets pretty interesting. They've created what's called a basic attention token. Now, a basic attention token, what it is that as the user of that browser, you can basically sign up for a wallet. Now, what you're actually doing is when you're actually looking at content, you can actually make a donation to that content publisher today. So you can basically make an Ethereum donation, and that goes to the publisher. The opportunity for this is, you take Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, a lot of those which have seen a big surge in subscriptions, but ultimately you're paying a subscription for some presumed use of all of that content. As a consumer, you could basically make micropayments to each and every publisher for content, and not just to traditional publishers, but this could also go back to advertisers, right? Because advertisers are getting more and more involved in content every day. You can the consumer can pay for the content, but also the consumer can also get paid for consuming advertising. So if they engage with ads, if they view an ad, all seen by this browser, you'll actually be able to deposit money in their account or into their wallet by form of tokens. And this is kind of the thing that's really interesting to me is the concept of this micropayment, right? So these things could be, decimals on a penny, right? Very, very small. And what's kind of interesting about that is it creates this kind of behavioral purity, right? And this purity is that, hey, these things are so small and they're on an individual basis, it's not really going to change my behavior. Because digital has tried incentivized advertising before, and it was ugly. It was really ugly. There was a lot of shady things happening in this kind of incentivized marketing world. Government had to get involved, and it kind of ended, thank God. But the concept of, hey, I can actually compensate somebody for their time only for the belief that when they look at their wallet at the end of the month and they see this kind of overall tally, then, hey, this is actually worth my time, and this makes me want to be a part of this ecosystem, right? And so you're not changing their behavior by form of the payment, but you are compensating for this new behavior. And it also, I think, in a lot of ways enables that kind of going back to that chain of events I talked about where consumers can actually be a part of the process all the way through and be compensated for that. Now, this all still seems pretty big, right? You need advertisers, you need media suppliers, and you need consumers, which on the consumer side, if anybody in the room hasn't gone over and spoken to a data wallet, I would highly recommend it, if only to kind of hear what their vision of the future looks like. It's pretty interesting. But this is the other thing to keep in mind is Equifax is a great example. Yahoo is another one. That breach was pretty bad when you think about the type of information that was taken, but also the sheer percent of America that actually had their really personal identifiable information taken. So you have that. Consumers are pissed off, and they're like, hey, I don't even know how Equifax got my information in the first place. But then you also think about all the people that got your social security number before it even made it to Equifax. Like, that's a big deal. Then you have what's happening with technology today, where you have facial identification, you have thumbprint identification, basically biometrics. Consumers are getting used to different ways to self-identify themselves. So if you think about this concept of where a consumer can biometrically identify beyond the blockchain, you will never know their name, who they are, anything like that. But they're validated and verified based on biometrics. That's actually pretty interesting. And then this is actually kind of cool too. Anybody in the room use mobile payment, Apple Pay, Android Pay? So I use it. I actually get pretty ticked off when they don't have it nowadays because it's just super handy. But the cool thing about it is that from a security standpoint, it's never sending across your credit card information. It's actually sending a token. And that token is then being reconciled on the back end. And so the cool thing about that is that consumers, subconsciously or consciously, they're getting used to the concept of tokens, right? These things that are going to be simply a bridge between here and there. So what I envision is that this could very well move a lot faster. You have a lot of investment dollars. You have a lot of developers solving problems, and then just the kind of growth of virtual currency. I mean, right now, I don't know what it is today, but I think a week or two ago, one Bitcoin was worth about 7,000 US. All of that is happening to create this momentum that this could really move a lot faster than any of us think. So, what's a roadmap? So what do you do from this? So this is also kind of the cool thing, kind of what I started with. Blockchain is not going to force everyone in this room to all of a sudden go out and be blockchain experts and be completely up to date on everything that's happening in virtual currencies. Blockchain is something that can really just kind of slowly kind of underpin a lot of the things we do. So like the nuance and the strategy and the creativity we have as an industry, it'll actually be improved by this without us actually having to become experts. But what I would say is that it is important for you to dig in so that you can kind of have that understanding of, hey, why should we look at this blockchain opportunity? Why should we look at this emerging technology? And I'll tell you kind of the cool thing is that your best research right now is probably going to be within your own company. Because right now, somebody in your company is actually looking at a blockchain solution for identity management, for currency transfers. So that being said, you actually are probably going to be able to just walk down to your IT department and say, blockchain. And guess what? People are going to come out of the woodwork. Also, a lot of the larger IT companies, so the Accentures, the Deloittes, they're all building blockchain consulting solutions. So it's going to move pretty fast, I think. This is the other thing I would just kind of note is that what you can do right now is meet with a lot of this emerging tech. So, meet with the folks like Data Wallet, meet with the folks like MetaX, meet with folks like Brave, so you can kind of understand about how this could potentially impact your business and your client's business. And then I would also just monitor for what I call stimulus events. So like the Equifax breach, the more those things keep happening, consumers are no longer going to want something new, they're actually going to force something new. And an ability to kind of be unique in kind of your digital life without being personally identifiable, that's actually a pretty cool opportunity for consumers. So hopefully you walk out of here feeling pretty optimistic, pretty excited, and not like a poop emoji. So.